As we move into preparing for speeches, it becomes important to think about who you're talking to. The first step in preparing most presentations is to analyze the audience. Or, in other words, you got to know who you're talking to before you ever figure out what to say to them. So that's what we're talking about today in this lecture is audience analysis. Audience analysis can be defined as the process of gathering and analyzing information about audience members in order for the speaker to adapt the message to that information. So again, it's about knowing who you're talking to so you can figure out how to speak to them. Doing this is what's called keeping an audience-centered approach to speaking, because the audience is your focus in making sure that you reach out and you understand what it is that they need. Whereas you do want to adapt to the audience, you want to avoid what's called pandering. To pander is to abandon your own convictions in favor of pleasing the audience. So, whereas you do want to make sure that your information is relevant and you do want to make sure that it fits the audience's ideas and what they need to hear, you don't want to take that to such an extent that you abandon what you believe in just to make them happy. So that's a danger that we run into sometimes, but it's a line that you don't have to cross just because you feel like you need to please the audience. When you're doing audience analysis, you want to look at the audience psychology, or what's going on in their head. Now, obviously, there's only so much of this that we can understand, but they're made up of these three things that you see here, these three concepts: values, beliefs, and attitudes. In the lecture about ethics, we talked about values, and this is the same term, core values. These are our most enduring judgments or standards of what's important to us, what's good and bad, that kind of thing. If you recall, values don't change. So your goal is never going to be to change the values of your audience. Your goals will be to change maybe attitudes or maybe beliefs, as we'll get into, but values, you're not going to change. But understanding the values of your audience will help you informing your ideas and presenting them in such a way that it won't violate anyone's values. Because if you violate someone's values, you compromise their ethics, they're likely to turn around and walk away from you at best. Beliefs are the ways in which people perceive reality or their conceptions about what is true or false. So it's what's real and what's not, what's true and what's false. Those are the things that you're dealing with here. Beliefs change over time. As we learn new things, we change our beliefs. But beliefs don't change overnight a lot of times. It takes some time, and it takes education. It takes effort to change beliefs. So again, this may not be your go-to target. Whenever you are working with an audience, you may not try to change their beliefs just at the outset. But if you're going to be working with a group over time and have multiple occasions to address them, you might be able to begin to change their belief structure. Attitudes, on the other hand, these are just our general evaluations of people, ideas, objects, or events. It's the way we feel at any given time about any given thing. We change attitudes easily. So attitudes are easily influenced even within something as simple as a speech. So typically this is going to be your target area is going to be it's going to be attitudes. Using audience analysis, we tap into what's called perspective taking, and that's just, again, another way of referring to sitting in their seat, seeing things from someone else's point of view, which helps us to identify what we need to say. So you identify the audience psychology, what their values are, beliefs, and attitudes, at least to the point that you can understand it. You need to figure out what the needs and wants of your audience are. You also will try to determine what their dispositions are toward the topic, the speaker, and the occasion. A disposition is a feeling or an attitude. And then you take that information and you integrate it into your speech. It will affect or impact the way that you speak and the things that you choose to talk about. You may or may not know members of your audience. So if you don't know them in particular, but you can make some assumptions based on what you see, we have the term demographics. Audience demographics are statistical characteristics of a given group or population. That's what demographics are. This is comprised of things like age or generational identity. That has to do with when you were raised and who raised you. Currently living in our society, we have 5 distinct generations. You have the matures, the baby boomer generation, Generation X, Generation Y, and Generation Z. The next one is socioeconomic status. This has more to do with level of income and type of job worked and level of education of audience members. And in my own experience, socioeconomic status does not really impact what an audience can understand, but it impacts how I say it, because different things will be important to people from different backgrounds. So the examples that I choose or the language that I use may change even if I'm delivering the same message to different groups of people. Religious and political affiliations, we don't even have to get into that to understand that there are distinct differences among different groups, and you will choose carefully how you speak. Now, when it comes to gender, again, different things are important to people of different genders, and so examples may change or vary. Humor may change and vary if you have an audience that is all of one gender or another, or if you have a mixed crowd. You have disability culture that you may be working with, and so you will always need to be guarded about how you refer to people with disabilities of different kinds. Remember, not all disabilities are visible, so you need to make sure that you are always respectful with your terminology. And ethnic and cultural background differences we have talked about in a prior lecture, but take what you've learned from that and from other places and apply it here to audience analysis. And you try to associate what's important to people from different cultures into what's important to the topic at hand. Now, here on this slide, a few more notes about culture. We have individualist and collectivist cultures. Individualist cultures have a focus in society to make decisions for the good of the individual and their immediate family. So in American culture, we're an individualist society. I make decisions for me and my immediate family, things that will benefit us. In a collectivist culture, you make decisions that will benefit the larger group, so the community, the organization that you work for, or even the country at large. So in individualist culture, we make decisions for me and mine. Collectivist cultures, we make decisions for the larger group, or for the benefit of the larger group. It's an oversimplification, but it gives you a general idea, at least for our purposes. A culture that has high uncertainty avoidance goes to great lengths to avoid the unknown. They don't typically like surprises or risk. So you want to have things very well explained and mapped out for a culture that has high uncertainty avoidance. However, a culture that has low uncertainty avoidance, they're okay with an element of unknown, of risk. And so you would talk differently to those two different cultural backgrounds, even if you're discussing the same concept. Power distance is about recognizing differences in levels of authority between individuals. So in some cultures, there are vast differences in people's social standing. You have a class system or a caste system. Other cultures, you have very low power distance, where everyone is equal and on equal footing. And then you have anywhere in between. Masculine and feminine traits in society is probably not quite what you think. A masculine culture has very clearly defined gender roles. So for instance, certain, let's say males do these certain jobs, females do these certain jobs, and you don't cross those lines. Whereas in a feminine culture, there is no stipulation on gender in regards to a job. The only stipulation has to do with your qualifications. And then lastly, here on this list, we have time orientation. Monochronic and polychronic cultures. A monochronic culture places a great deal of importance on the concept of time. So in our culture, the American culture, we are a monochronic society. We get offended when someone wastes our time. Why? Because time is money. We hold it as a commodity, something that's very important. Whereas in a polychronic culture, polychronic cultures, the importance of time takes a backseat to social harmony and more or less just being on the same page with other people. So relationship is more important than timing. Really, on all of these, I gave you an oversimplification, but a general idea of where to start if you are working with people from different cultures than your own. In some situations, you may be able to have access to a group of people you're going to speak to. In other situations, you won't. If you're able to sit down and talk to people ahead of time, that's great. Do interviews and that kind of thing. An interview is a person-to-person communication with a basic information gathering purpose. And in an interview, you can ask mainly open questions or open-ended questions is what we use. Maybe with a few closed-ended questions. But the idea is you're trying to get rich, deep information through an interview. Your other option would be to do surveys or questionnaires. These get a wide breadth of information, but not very deep information typically. You may ask a couple open-ended questions, but you're mainly going to ask closed-ended questions. Or fix alternative questions, things like multiple choice questions, or you may use scale questions. So interviews and surveys both accomplish similar things, but the level of richness and depth of information will vary between the two. The disadvantage to interviews is that they take a long time. Surveys don't take very long to complete. The advantage to interviews is that you get deep information, rich information about one or two or three people. Whereas with surveys, you can get a wide breadth of information about 50 people in the same amount of time. So they're used for different ends most of the time. Other places you can look for information to be things like published sources, brochures, newspaper articles, organizational documents or websites, reports. Specifically, if you are going to do maybe a job interview or something like that with a company that you haven't been to before, that you're not very familiar with. It would do you good to read up on them, and that's a form of doing audience analysis. If you're moving to a new town or considering moving to a new town and say you're going to that job interview, you may want to look at local polls or even state polls if it's to a new state that you're unfamiliar with. Public opinion polls or political polls or those kinds of things, so that you can get a feel for the local opinions and ideas to see if you're a good fit or if they're a good fit for you. One final thought here when it comes to analyzing the situation, taking a step beyond just the audience and how they think and all of that. Here's 4 more features to consider. The first one is the size of the audience. You speak differently to a group of 12 than you do to a group of 200. You're going to interact with them differently, non-verbally and verbally. There's going to be a different energy about your presentation. With a small group, you can interact non-verbally with everyone. The larger the group, the more difficult that becomes. And whenever you reach a certain point, you can no longer interact with an entire group of people, even non-verbally. So you start maybe interacting with zones of people within the large group. The physical setting is another consideration to make. What's going to be available to me? Will I have a projector? Will I have a podium? Will I be up on a stage in front of people? Or will I be at the end of a board table? Or, what is the physical setting? Ask questions ahead of time to see what you'll be working with. Another consideration is time of day and the length of your presentation. At different times of day, people are more awake or more fatigued. And so that might be a consideration for you in how you deliver information and the amount of time you spend speaking. And then the speech context is also something that's very important. It's also known as the rhetorical situation, but remember the context is what's going on surrounding the situation. So again, you're going to ask yourself those questions. Where am I? Who am I in this situation? And what is appropriate to talk about? And how is it appropriate to talk about it? So you're really thinking about how you fit into the situation and what the expectation is. So you're trying to meet that.